This is the Vancouver most people recognize. Glass high-rises next to the water with a backdrop of mountains. It's what you see on the tourism ads, postcards, and magnets. But this Vancouver is just half the picture. Just take a walk out of downtown and within minutes you see this. Quiet sidewalks, grass monoculture, and yeah, just regular houses. In fact, these houses make up 81% of the residential land in Vancouver. I think there's a problem with that picture, and to understand that, we have to talk about what's not in the picture. The missing middle. In Metro Vancouver, we primarily have two types of housing, the high-rise or the single-family house. Just look at Brentwood Town Centre in Burnaby, the second and fourth tallest buildings in British Columbia next to single-family houses. To say it sticks out like a sore thumb would be the understatement of the year. This is the Titanic next to rowboats. Here's another example, Marine Drive in South Vancouver. High-rises, single-family houses. Are you getting the picture? When it comes to housing in Metro Vancouver, it's often supersize or Happy Meal, go big or go home, literally. What's missing are the buildings in between those sizes, things like townhouses, row houses, co-housing walk-ups, or the dingbat. No, this kind of dingbat. These buildings have been coined the missing middle. We just don't build them. In 2018, Vancouver saw the construction of 1,400 detached houses, 4,400 apartment units, and just 56 row houses. Now, why should you care? Well, maybe you've heard of a little thing called the house. Yup, we're in a housing crisis, and most of the new housing we build is in huge, complicated, and often controversial developments. They require tons of planning, concrete, elevators, architects, and sometimes a leaning tower of condominiums. And very few people even want this kind of housing. A survey found that condos were the preferred housing option for just 7% of Vancouverites and 0% of people with acrophobia. That's why many see a lot of promise in the missing middle. A more measured, more sensitive, and ultimately more desirable way to add housing without resorting to glass condos. How? Like this. This is the Snail in Strathcona, a 3-story walk-up apartment that provides 11 housing units with a little cafe, grocery, and hair salon on the bottom floor. Just down the street is another building, this one with 12 units of housing, and you can barely tell it apart from the other houses. That is the potential behind missing middle housing. These buildings fit a lot more units than your traditional house in the same amount of space without creating a huge disturbance. Instead of pushing one incredibly disruptive project at a time, we can spread out a whole lot of new housing more discreetly over a larger area. Now, will townhouses and walk-up apartments single-handedly solve our housing crisis? Probably not. Trust me, it's complicated. But what I do want to get into is why we don't build this kind of housing in the first place. Why is the missing middle missing? Well, it turns out there's a simple answer to that. It's illegal. The Snail was built in 1906, and times have really changed. Today, we have rules. For starters, you can't build right up to the sidewalk. You can't have your building be too tall, and you have to provide parking spaces, which for a building like the Snail would require a concrete parkade underground. But the real kicker is the zoning bylaw. Check out this zoning map of Vancouver. All those areas in yellow are areas where you are only allowed to build a single-family house with a secondary suite and laneway house. Nothing else. So that cafe, not okay. And 11 units of housing, don't even think about it. So why is the missing middle missing? We killed it off with regulations. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts. So to me, that begs another question. Why did we do that? This zoning map goes back to 1927. Vancouver was a rapidly growing city at the time, and it hired this guy, Harlan Bartholomew, to create this zoning map with one key objective: prevent the intrusion of apartment houses in single or two-family residential areas. You see, back then, apartments had a PR problem. Many saw them as substandard housing with cramped living spaces, poor air circulation, and general squalor. They were often described as slums, associated with all kinds of fun things like alcohol, clubs, and sex workers, but also not so fun things like fire, disease, and crime. For those who could afford it, the single-family home just outside the city was a refuge. For these neighborhoods, apartments were a threat, the precursors of slums. Single-family neighborhoods had to be defended, and the city's weapon of choice was the zoning bylaw. With those zoning bylaws came other rules, like setback and height requirements, as well as parking minimums. With these rules, the city became divided. Downtown areas with industry, businesses, and apartments, and single-family neighborhoods. Now, these concerns are fairly reasonable on paper. I mean, who doesn't want to protect public health and safety? But if we left it at that, we'd be ignoring a very important and more disturbing part of this story. In 1907, Vancouver's Saturday Sunset published this political cartoon. On one panel is the typical house of a white working man. On the next panel, a warren on Carroll Street invested by 2,000 Chinese. Yeah, many homeowners weren't just hostile to the apartment, they were hostile to the people living in them. Immigrants, single men and women, and the working poor. When you see it this way, you see zoning in a different light. I think historian Anthony Sutcliffe summarizes it well. Zoning originated not only to promote safer, healthier cities, but also to keep the poor in their place. Now over time, our ideas about downtown evolved. More people got access to running water, we invented fire extinguishers and smoke detectors. These days, no one's really concerned about fires and cholera. But our zoning bylaws have remained, and any ideas for adding housing density in single-family neighborhoods get a lot of pushback. Again, it's a messy mix of concerns. Opponents often worry that more housing would affect their privacy, create more noise, more shadows, traffic, more competition for street parking, and ultimately, ruin the character of their neighborhoods. But like the past, these concerns continue to be entangled with less tolerant views as well. In 1988, a group of Shaughnessy and Kerrisdale residents petitioned the city of Vancouver to block the construction of monster homes, large houses that were popular with recent immigrants from Hong Kong. You had the same old worries around heritage and character, but it seemed like some residents were less concerned about the houses and more concerned about the people inside them. Just read this letter to City Council. We fear the power that Hong Kong money wields. These people come with no concern for our past. They have no right to devastate the residential areas. Opposition to new housing is messy, made up of both understandable and disturbing views. It can be really difficult to separate them, but ultimately, all those messy concerns have created a clear pattern of development. We build new housing in the few select areas where there is little opposition, and we build big, like this. The Expo Lands, a former industrial site which was empty and far away from other neighborhoods in the 80s. Today, it holds over 15,000 people and 50 buildings. You see a similar pattern of development across Metro Vancouver, in neighborhoods like Olympic Village, Brentwood Town Centre. Former councillor Gordon Price describes this as the grand bargain. City Hall won't rezone a blade of grass in your single-family zones, but we will pile the density up in high-rises. The answer to the missing middle mystery ultimately lies in this political dynamic. When you protect single-family house neighborhoods against a growing downtown for almost a century, you get lots of towers and lots of houses with very little in between. For much of our history, that has worked out pretty well. Vancouver's glass condominiums are world-renowned, and we have books written about our urban planning. But today, that's creating some new problems. We've mostly built out all the non-controversial areas. There are not that many sites like the Expo Lands left. Today, our mega developments are increasingly piled onto SkyTrain stations and shopping malls like Brentwood Town Centre, but they're also going into areas with more vulnerable residents. They demolish old buildings in Chinatown, cheap rental apartments in Burnaby. In these neighborhoods, new development doesn't just change character, it evicts people. And ultimately, our zoning bylaws have created a city that is socially and physically divided. We've been able to protect the single-family house, but only the wealthiest of the wealthy can afford it. But I hate to be a bummer, so I'm not going to end the video there. At the heart of this issue is really just a set of rules. And rules can change. Cities like Minneapolis and Portland have eliminated the single-family zone entirely. Here in Vancouver, new policies like the Vancouver Plan might reconsider zoning across the city. These rules don't even have to change that much. In 2019, Urbanarium hosted a competition inviting architects to design missing middle housing for neighborhoods in Metro Vancouver. What they found was that with some small changes to our zoning bylaws, setback restrictions, and parking minimums, you could introduce a whole new variety of housing into our single-family neighborhoods. For example, the first place winner, Micro-op. By reducing the setback requirements, it fits 7 units of housing into a 3.5-story building. Or the second place winner, People's Playbook. Reducing setback requirements and reducing the parking minimum by half allowed for up to 12 units across 2 properties. And these ideas aren't just about fitting as many people into a space as possible. It's clear that they emphasize a different approach to living. From co-op financing models to shared roof decks and backyards, these buildings also propose a more communal way of living together, where you can share resources and space with your neighbors. Now, you may have mixed opinions about these designs and ideas, but what's undeniable is that our politics around development have resulted in a very divided and exclusive pattern of housing. So, I think we should ask ourselves, are we okay with that? Or do we feel like something